So Kill Your Lover is about a relationship where it has been growing slowly more and more toxic. And as Dakota, who's the lead female character, the more she tries to break up with her partner Axel, the more he becomes infected with this strange illness that causes him to grow black veins all over his body. And when he touches people, it melts their skin, and it just keeps escalating and getting worse and worse and worse. It's kind of a metaphor. If if it's not obvious enough, it's definitely, that's kind of the idea. It kind of jumps backwards and forwards in time too, so we kind of see how like they began, and then we get a sense of how like the relationship slowly starts to fester and rot over time.
So body horror is just one of those, we just like this aspect of human horror, and like anything that gets under your skin, like the closer we can get to the like human experience, the better. So I think, things that are relatable but still distanced enough that help us like process things before they happen. I mean, we were kind of talking about this recently, about this idea of, being able to process death before death happens. So whether it's for a loved one, or our own decay, if you will, as age happens. Like, it's something we're just very fascinated with. And I think, being morbid is not a bad thing. I think it's just a way of, like, confronting our fears and actually becoming better humans because of it. So that's what body horror is for me as well.
I mean, I think that I'm kind of obsessed with this idea that we as human beings are just essentially giant piles of rotting meat, and that, we're slowly breaking down over the course of our lives, and there's something just kind of like horrifying and grotesque in this very sort of small scale, like real way about that. So like, I think like when you start bringing in things like disease and, affliction and all of these things, that they start to feel like really quite like visceral. And I think there's definitely an element of that that's always really engaged me, particularly about horror.
I would also say, like, even speaking to our movie, Kill Your Lover, like I've always found interesting is this idea of being able to take what's inside and get it out. Mm-hmm. And like, sometimes I remember like even as a child thinking, or as a teenager, whatever, like, you're going through, maybe you're having trouble at school, and like I just was like, oh, I wish everyone could see how beaten up I am inside. And I think there's probably part of it that's like, again, like that processing of that. So the literalizing, the exercising of what's inside that I find very like cathartic as well. I think there was a big element for us that was about this almost like the kaleidoscopic nature of how love feels, how a relationship can feel, especially when things are getting a bit dicey and like breaking apart. At the beginning, you've got sort of like almost like the rose-tinted glasses, which is a term we have, I don't know, rosa Brille, so something like that. So I think, you've kind of got this sort of like pink wash over like the past that keeps interjecting with the present, which is sort of a bit colder. And like we were just trying to build this real timeline that also reflects back to nicer times, but also starts showing those red flags throughout as well. But also trying to intersperse the horror at good points as well.
And I think that there's like an element to which a lot of like modern films have become very literal in terms of like both their visual language and in what they're trying to portray. And I think we've become very enamored with this notion of something having emotional truth rather than kind of literal, a literal feeling to it. And I think we were definitely going for a more operatic feel. So it's like when you're kind of like in the past, it feels more like a memory. It feels more like this kind of emotional truth rather than, just sort of a literal idea of like the A to B to C of what happened within the relationship. It's more about how it felt to the people in that moment. And I think that that's kind of like where certainly something like, say, Eternal Sunshine, or like a big one for us was Blue Valentine, where you kind of you're feeling what the characters emotionally felt in those moments. If you tell a story entirely linearly sometimes, it's actually very dull. Like if you just watch the relationship, start and just we followed it linearly through the whole thing and then got to the end and there's a bunch of horror at the end, it ceases to be very narratively satisfying. So there's a very good functional reason why to like have a non-linear plot, because it actually is a lot more dramatically satisfying for the viewer.
Yeah, and also like speaking to the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is like, especially towards the end of the film, there's these things that keep repeating and it gets more and more fractured, and that again, speaking to that kaleidoscopic thing we were talking about, is it just these fragments of bits and you go, oh, I've seen that before and that's happened before, and why aren't they recognizing the pattern? And then it gets more and more and more frequent and you think you're going insane, and then eventually it has to collapse. And so that's, we really wanted to build to that and introduce that. And we have a lot of subjective perspective in the movie as well for that reason, which I think, links up. We wanted both of the characters to have a voice, so I'm really glad that carried through for you.
And it was an interesting process as well, because I think a lot of times when you write a first draft, by its nature, it has to be a little bit more black and white, a little bit more simplistic, because a lot of times you're just trying to get the structure and the character beats down. But I think the big thing that as we kept developing it was to make it muddier, and especially Alix was a particularly big proponent of Axel needs to be more sympathetic, because at the beginning our first draft was much more Dakota's the good guy, Axel's the bad guy, and then as we kept going, it was like really you who was just kind of like, we need to make Axel more sympathetic. And it's really funny because we have especially a lot of women who will like watch it and go like, I hate that I like him. I hate that I kind of like, I see where he's coming from on things.
I agree with some of the stuff he's saying. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is like what we realized is, we make monster movies. That's been our thing. Like when we've been in the horror genre, we have made other movies as well, but when we've been in the horror genre, we seem to always end up making monster movies in some way or another. And what we realized is, Axel, yes, he is a monster, don't get me wrong, but the actual real monster, if you look closely, is the relationship itself. So it's neither person is inherently evil. They're just in a situation that isn't working for them anymore. And one of them is holding on to it, and the other one is going, no, we need to let go, and they're just beefing it out until something breaks.
Well, I think we're very inspired too by, say, like the notion of, like Frankenstein. Like Frankenstein is, Frankenstein's monster is the monster of the film, but he is ultimately still sympathetic. He does terrible things, but it's also because of the circumstances, the emotional like turmoil that he's in. And that's what's so engaging about that character and that movie, and why it's kind of like stood the test of time, is because someone is or something is the monster doesn't mean it can't have nuances to it. I think the way we always viewed it is that Dakota is only the protagonist because she's the one who sees that the relationship needs to end. And that's ultimately what's best for both of them. But in terms of their actual behavior in the relationship, neither one of them is actually like, wholly to blame for anything. We're really heavily inspired by South Korean cinema. And one of the things that we love about South Korean cinema is that you get these crazy like tonal shifts. And so you'll be like dealing with like the bleakest subject matter, and then suddenly you'll have almost like borderline like slapstick or physical comedy. And Park Chan-wook like talks about this notion of like when things become so absurd and so bleak that you have to almost acknowledge the absurdity of it. And I think like that's it, is like, I think in Western film there's an awful lot of like this idea of like that you have to commit to a tone and just keep that tone throughout the entire thing. But I do think that often Asian cinema is much more open with this idea of that you can have incredibly bleak things that are also funny. And, the best dramas have moments of levity in it. Even if you're watching something like Schindler's List or something like that, there will be moments where characters joke to each other or have like, because like that's part of life. Part of life is finding the humor of the absurdity in it. And I think that people get this misunderstanding of you're making a serious thing, therefore it needs to be 100% serious across the board. And I think that, yeah, we try to stay away from things just being completely oppressive.
Yeah, because I think, there's this notion of gallows humor, in order to cope with terrible, horrible situations, you do have to have that counterpoint, because otherwise, again, you go insane. So I think just this idea of having a more absurdist humor in it, because life is absurd, love is absurd, so it only stands to reason. Like, people don't behave entirely logically all the time, especially when they're in an emotionally fraught situation. So when everything is so heightened, it can be, it would seem silly to just suddenly just be very reasonable and go, you know what, actually, I'm going to go this way and I'm going to call my friend and just get myself out of this situation. Is, you still have a connection. So with Dakota and Axel, they still have this connection, and she has an opportunity to escape, for instance. But ultimately, whatever you decide, the reason is that she goes back. She feels that either she owes it to him, or maybe she feels guilty because she's like, no, I'm not the kind of person who just leaves someone in the lurch like that. Any number of reasons she could be going back. But I'm sure there'll also be people who are just like, no, just go. The elevator's like right there. Like, why would you go back? But to us, that's one of the many ways in which it's symbolic of sort of the push and pull of how, people can orbit around each other like planets for far too long because of all of the damage we carry with us. And I think a lot of it is about having a moment of being able to distance yourself and really assess the situation. And sometimes someone else has to pull you out of that. But ideally it would be yourself.
Well, and I also think that, it's like sometimes in terms of like giving the audience like you want to give the audience something like a release of some sort as well. So there's a particularly big laugh that comes after a very like intense, like crazy moment. And I think it's a kind of nice release point for the audience at that point, where they get to kind of like almost just kind of go like, yeah, that was crazy what just happened. It's nice to give the audience those kind of moments of release.
I think, the plan is definitely to keep making features now. We're hooked. But we see Kill Your Lover as being very much like spiritually like related to Wretch. I think the humor is there, but also the body horror is there. But I think the main difference moving into the feature film world was definitely finding those moments of quiet as well, and those moments of like lingering, because you can't just go at 100 miles an hour, because otherwise it's too exhausting. And like, don't get me wrong, our movie is fairly emotionally and like physically exhausting in many ways, but that's why it was good that we had to really like take a step back and go, okay, where are the moments? And I think that's where the past and present structure also really helped, because we talked about some of the moments almost being like little islands, little oasis that audience could like catch a breath, and getting that pacing right was very important to us, and where we're really happy that it seems to have worked out well.
Well, and I think like the big thing for us with Wretch was that I think Sam Raimi, when he made Drag Me to Hell, talked about the notion of the film being a ghost train. It's there to take you on a ride. And I think that we do, to a certain extent, look at our films as kind of like they are rides of sorts. They're supposed to take the audience through an experience. It's why we try as much as we can to have sort of a fluid transitions between things, have more of a flow to it, so it just feels like it flows through an entire experience. And I think in that way, that was something that we really started with Wretch, as this kind of notion of something that just is a full unified experience. And I think that's what we tried to bring into the feature film side of things. I mean, it's a short movie. It's only 77 minutes, but it's like it should feel like a kind of like overall just experience that you've been on.
Yeah, I would also say in terms of like the work that we're looking to make next, we've written several scripts, so we have several scripts ready to go, and I do think that they follow that sort of ride element, but we'd obviously also really love to work with other writers, because we're all film lovers, so it's like we're interested in all kinds of stuff. but definitely taking people on crazy rides seems to be our modus operandi. One of the things, if you see the movie, you'll see a little hint at what's coming next after the credits roll. We've got a film that again is kind of linked to Kill Your Lover, but it is in a different world, and it's essentially what we're calling our baby shower massacre movie, which is, yeah, it's going to be pretty nuts. It's about a woman that gets possessed by her baby, without giving too much away.
And if it's you could almost call the film Kill Your Mother.
Yeah.
We're going after all relationships one by
Yes,
one, you
exactly.
know. Eventually we'll, except for dogs, because, you know, the human-dog relationship is just sacred.
Agreed.